The outboard wars of the 1980s were brutal. Johnson and Evinrude thought they had Mercury cornered. Then, almost out of nowhere, Mercury pulled the cover off a machine so big, so loud, and so shocking that it didn't just change boating, it scared the life out of OMC. Nobody believed they would actually build it. Nobody was ready for the roar that followed. What happened next turned into one of the most ruthless chapters in marine history. By the mid-1970s, the outboard world was a two-horse race. On one side stood OMC, the giant behind Johnson and Evinrude, with a reputation built on dependability and a dealer network that reached into every marina in America. On the other was Mercury, the black sheep with a reputation for speed, innovation, and winning races. Walk down a dock in Florida or Minnesota, and chances were you would see more white and blue OMC cowls than Mercury's sleek black paint. On paper, OMC looked untouchable. But Mercury was never content to play second fiddle. Their inline-six Tower of Power models had already built a cult following, screaming across lakes and rivers at speeds OMC engines could only chase. The company leaned heavily into racing, pouring money into offshore competitions, base tournaments, and speed trials. Each victory gave them free advertising and fed into their image as the choice for anyone who wanted to go fast. Even if Mercury sold fewer engines overall, they owned the bragging rights when it came to performance. The rivalry spilled far beyond the water. Dealers argued like rival sports fans, each swearing their brand was the only true option. Boat builders had to choose carefully, because hanging Johnsons on your hulls often meant Mercury would not touch you, and vice versa. This wasn't a polite business competition. It was tribal, with customers fiercely loyal to their chosen color scheme, and companies willing to use every tool possible to gain an edge. By the late 70s, OMC was still king in sheer numbers, but Mercury had planted seeds of doubt. Rumors of bigger engines were swirling, and both sides were pushing engineers to the limit. The stage was set for one of the boldest moves in outboard history. If you think that rivalry was wild, wait until you see the monster Mercury built to silence OMC. Stick around, this story only gets louder from here, and subscribe while you're at it. Competition between Mercury and OMC was never gentle. By the late 1970s, it had become a high-stakes battle where winning meant survival. OMC leaned heavily on its unmatched dealer presence. In small-town marinas, fishermen often trusted their Johnson or Evinrude dealers like family mechanics. They had parts in stock, service bays ready, and advertising everywhere. Mercury, meanwhile, played a different game. They poured resources into innovation and racing. Their philosophy was simple. If their engines won on the water, boat buyers would take notice. And it worked. Each offshore victory or base tournament trophy chipped away at OMC's reputation for dominance. The rivalry wasn't just about horsepower figures, it was about culture. Mercury wore black cowls like battle armor, cultivating an image of rebellion and speed. OMC leaned on tradition and trust, marketing their engines as reliable companions for family fishermen. Customers picked sides almost like they picked football teams. At ramps and docks, arguments broke out over which brand would last longer, run harder, or get a boat across the lake first. In some regions, OMC loyalists called Mercury buyers reckless, while Mercury fans dismissed OMC as boring. Behind the scenes, the fight was just as intense. Boat builders who partnered with one brand risked alienating the other. Independent dealers had to be careful, because taking on Mercury often meant losing access to Johnson or Evinrude contracts. Some even reported factory reps openly bad-mouthing the competition during sales visits. It was the kind of cutthroat rivalry where everything was fair game. By the end of the decade, it was clear both companies were planning their next move. OMC was rumored to be developing bigger V6s. Mercury engineers, sensing the need to outdo them, started drawing up something radical. Neither side wanted to blink first, and the arms race was about to reach new heights. In 1979, Mercury revealed what would become one of the most audacious moves in outboard history, the 3.4-liter V8. For years, boaters had debated whether Mercury could ever truly challenge OMC's dominance in raw numbers. Nobody expected Mercury to go for sheer shock value. Yet when this black-cowled giant first appeared at boat shows and offshore docks, jaws dropped. It wasn't just another outboard. It was a towering symbol that Mercury was willing to rewrite the rules of the game. The sheer size of the engine was the first thing people noticed. Side by side with Mercury's famous inline sixes, the V8 looked almost oversized, like someone had bolted an automotive block onto a transom. And in many ways, that impression wasn't far from the truth. The 3.4 was big, wide, and unapologetically heavy. But then came the numbers. Early versions pushed out 275 horsepower, and later models hit 300. At a time when 150 horsepower was considered serious power, these figures were outrageous. For fishermen and racers, the appeal was instant. A single Mercury V8 could carry a heavy offshore hull with authority. Two or more strapped across the back of a racing catamaran looked and sounded like cannons lined up for battle. The power delivery was brutal, with torque that made even large boats leap onto plane. Suddenly, Mercury wasn't just keeping up with OMC. They were leading the conversation with something that felt larger than life. It didn't take long for word to spread. Dealers said people came into showrooms just to see one sitting on a stand. Crowds gathered at launch ramps when someone fired one up. Mercury hadn't just launched an engine, they had created an event. For a company long painted as the scrappy underdog, the V8 was a statement that Mercury wasn't afraid to aim higher and bolder than anyone else. What really set the Mercury V8 apart was not just the horsepower rating, but the way it delivered that power. The 3.4-liter block produced torque in massive waves, something boaters could feel the moment they hit the throttle. On a heavy offshore boat, it meant pulling away from swells without struggling. On a base boat, it meant launching out of the hole like a drag car. Owners often said it felt less like an outboard and more like a muscle engine borrowed straight from Detroit and strapped to a transom. And then there was the sound. Ask anyone who was around a marina in the early 1980s, and they will tell you that you could hear a Mercury V8 long before you could see it. At idle, it rumbled with a deep, throaty beat that vibrated across docks. Open the throttle, and it roared like a muscle car tearing down a straightaway. Some joked you didn't need to tell people you owned one. The engine would announce your arrival before you even tied up. Dealers quickly discovered that the sound was a selling tool all on its own. One Florida salesman admitted that he sold more V8s by simply starting one up on a trailer than by any polished pitch. Curious boaters would wander over, drawn by the thunder, and before long they were picturing it, bolted to the back of their rig. The roar was intoxicating, and for many, it sealed the deal. Beyond specs and marketing, the Mercury V8 had something rare in the boating world: personality. Engines were often talked about in terms of reliability, fuel economy, or horsepower per dollar. But this one carried an aura. It made owners feel larger than life, and it made rivals stare. That combination of sound, torque, and sheer presence ensured it would never be mistaken for just another motor. For all its jaw-dropping power, the Mercury V8 was far from perfect. The first thing critics pointed out was its weight. Tipping the scales at well over 600 pounds, it was nearly double the weight of smaller V6 engines on the market. On light fishing boats, it could feel like strapping an anchor to the transom. Mechanics joked that installing one required a crane, and many owners had to reinforce their transoms just to carry the load. It was a beast, and that size came with real trade-offs. Then there was the fuel consumption. In an era still haunted by the oil shocks of the 1970s, the Mercury V8 was unapologetically thirsty. Wide open, it could drain a fuel tank at a pace that made owners wince at the marina pump. Offshore racers and tournament anglers didn't mind as much, but casual boaters quickly realized that feeding a V8 could be more expensive than buying it. Bring a credit card and a gas dock became a common line among skeptics. Maintenance was another sticking point. More cylinders meant more plugs, more carburetors, and more things to adjust. Skilled mechanics loved the challenge, but for weekend boaters, it was intimidating. Some joked that if you owned a Mercury V8, you either learned to wrench on it yourself or made friends with a patient dealer. It was a love-hate relationship, with the roar of the throttle balancing out the headaches of upkeep. Despite its flaws, the Mercury V8 carried a strange charm. Owners forgave the weight and the fuel bills because the engine delivered something few others could. Unmatched bragging rights. It was loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. For Mercury, those limits didn't kill the engine. They only added to its legend as a machine too wild to be practical, yet too spectacular to forget. When Mercury unleashed the V8, OMC suddenly looked flat-footed. Johnson and Evinrude had built their reputation on reliable V4s and V6s, engines that appealed to the everyday boater. But they had nothing close to Mercury's 3.4-liter monster. Their most powerful models hovered around 200 horsepower, and while those engines were dependable, they lacked the shock factor Mercury had just introduced. Dealers who once bragged about OMC's dominance now found themselves answering awkward questions about why their lineup stopped short of the new benchmark. OMC did try to fight back. They rolled out beefed-up V6 models, pushing horsepower ratings higher each year, and their marketing leaned heavily on efficiency and reliability. For family fishermen and casual boaters, those were still strong selling points. But in the image-driven world of speed and power, OMC couldn't match Mercury's thunder. Mercury's black cowls and roaring V8s were plastered all over racing photos, magazine covers, and boat shows. OMC's quieter, practical approach just didn't stir the same excitement. Dealers reported losing sales to Mercury even when customers admitted the V8 was impractical. Some buyers simply wanted to own the biggest outboard available, no matter the cost or fuel burn. Mercury had found a way to make boating aspirational, while OMC was stuck defending practical choices. The contrast made Johnson's and Evinrude's feel safe, but uninspired, like buying a family sedan when your neighbor had just pulled into the driveway with a muscle car. Behind closed doors, OMC engineers explored their own big engine projects, but nothing came to market that matched Mercury's spectacle. By the mid-1980s, the damage was done. Mercury had stolen the narrative, and for the first time in decades, OMC was no longer the company setting the pace. They were chasing, and it showed. If there was one arena where the Mercury V8 made its biggest splash, it was racing. Offshore competitions in the 1980s became rolling advertisements for Mercury, as catamarans and deep V hulls screamed across the waves with twin or even triple V8s bolted to their transoms. The sheer sight of that much hardware lined up at the stern was enough to silence critics. And once the green flag dropped, the sound told the rest of the story. The roar of multiple Mercury V8s echoed like artillery fire, shaking docks and thrilling spectators. For racers, It was the edge they had been waiting for. These victories weren't just trophies, they were marketing gold. Every time a Mercury-powered boat crossed the finish line first, dealers back home reaped the rewards. Anglers and weekend boaters who read about the wins in magazines or saw them at shows started associating Mercury with unbeatable performance. It didn't matter that most of them would never need 275 or 300 horsepower. The halo effect was real, and Mercury's reputation skyrocketed. Anecdotes from the era tell the same story. Fishermen recalled showing up to tournaments and watching as everyone craned their necks toward the guy with the new V8. Mechanics remembered the grin on owners' faces when they first fired one up in the service bay. Even skeptics who swore by OMC admitted the Mercury sounded incredible on the water. The V8 wasn't just an engine, it was a spectacle, and that spectacle drew attention everywhere it went. By leaning into racing, Mercury turned the V8 into more than a machine. It became a symbol of ambition, of pushing boundaries, of daring to build something outrageous when everyone else played it safe. And in the 1980s, that roar carried further than any advertisement ever could. As bold as the Mercury V8 was, its reign was destined to be short. By the mid-1980s, fuel prices were climbing again, and the boating market was shifting. Weekend boaters who once dreamed of thunderous V8 power began asking harder questions about operating costs. Filling twin 100-gallon tanks only to watch the gauges sink after a day on the water was a luxury few could justify. The very thing that made the V8 a legend, its appetite for power, also made it increasingly impractical in a changing world. Weight was another lingering problem. Smaller hulls struggled to balance with so much mass hanging on the transom, and not every boat builder wanted to redesign their lines around one engine. Mercury's V6 lineup, lighter and far more versatile, started to look like the smarter choice for most buyers. Dealers quietly admitted that as impressive as the V8 was, they sold far more six-cylinder models because they fit a wider range of boats without breaking wallets at the fuel dock. Mercury themselves began to recognize the writing on the wall. The V8 had done its job as a halo product, drawing headlines and humiliating OMC, but it was never going to be the backbone of the lineup. Development shifted toward refining V6 platforms, engines that delivered nearly as much power with far fewer compromises. Racers and hardcore enthusiasts still loved the V8, but the average boater was moving on. By the late 1980s, production numbers dwindled. The mighty 3.4-liter had shaken the industry, but it could not outrun economic realities. The very roar that once silenced OMC was fading from marinas, leaving behind only stories, nostalgia, and a legend larger than the engine itself. Even though the Mercury V8 disappeared from production by the end of the 1980s, its legend has only grown stronger with time. For collectors, spotting one today is like finding buried treasure. At boat shows, restored examples draw crowds the way they did 4 decades ago. Owners polish the black cowls like jewelry, proud to show off the beast that once turned the outboard world on its head. Videos of these engines firing up on trailers rack up thousands of views online, proving the roar is still irresistible. Among enthusiasts, the Mercury V8 has become a symbol of an era when companies dared to build outrageous machines just to prove they could. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't sensible, and it wasn't designed for everyone. But it showed how far Mercury was willing to go to claim bragging rights. In hindsight, that audacity defined the brand just as much as any sales chart ever did. The engine also left its mark on OMC's story. While the company soldiered on with dependable V6, the psychological blow of being outgunned in the power race stung. In the decades that followed, OMC struggled with finances, product decisions, and eventually collapsed entirely. Many historians of the outboard wars point to Mercury's V8 as a turning point, a moment when OMC's dominance began to crumble under the weight of new competition. For boaters who lived through the era, the memories remain vivid. The smell of fuel, the sight of offshore racers bristling with black cowls, the deep rumble across a quiet marina. These are the snapshots that keep the V8 alive today. It was more than just an engine. It was a statement, and its echo is still felt wherever outboard history is told. The Mercury V8 may have been heavy, thirsty, and far from practical, but it was never meant to be ordinary. It was an audacious move that shouted louder than any advertisement Mercury could have paid for. In one bold stroke, it flipped the script on OMC, turned dockside debates upside down, and left an impression so strong that we're still talking about it more than 40 years later. Engines come and go, but very few ever achieve legend status. The V8 did because it wasn't just about horsepower. It was about pride, rivalry, and the thrill of going bigger than anyone thought possible. And now I want to hear from you. Did you ever see a Mercury V8 thunder across the water? Maybe you owned one, or maybe you just remember the sound echoing from a distance. Drop your stories in the comments. I'll be reading them all. If you enjoyed this dive into one of outboard history's wildest chapters, hit that like button, share this with a fellow boater, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep cut into boating's past. Because trust me, there are plenty more legends left to tell.